Imagine being given up for dead, lost to the unforgiving ice of Antarctica, only for the impossible to happen. On May 20, 1916, at a whaling station on South Georgia Island, three figures suddenly appeared, men long believed to be dead. Their beards were long, their clothes in tatters, and their faces blackened by the brutal cold and sun. Their condition was so dire that no one present could recognize them. How could they? These were men who had vanished 532 days prior, presumed lost to the world. They were part of an expedition of 28 companions who had embarked on a ship to explore Antarctica, the coldest and most perilous place on Earth. Their dream was audacious, to reach the coast of the Weddell Sea and then cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot, a feat no one had ever accomplished. But Antarctica's icy embrace had other plans. Soon, they were plunged into an ordeal far beyond anything they could have imagined. Within months, the ice sheets in the Weddell Sea grew so thick that their ship became hopelessly trapped, eventually sinking before their very eyes. Thus, 28 souls found themselves stranded in the world's most desolate and frigid region, surrounded by a silence broken only by snow, storms, and the specter of death. During these perilous times, they were forced to live for months on floating ice. Food and water quickly ran out, compelling them to make unimaginable decisions for survival, choices that would make one's soul tremble. To save their lives, they even had to kill the very dogs they had brought with them. This is not merely a tale of an expedition, it is an epic saga of human courage, leadership, and survival, where the line between life and death was as thin as a single wrong step each day. Join us on a journey where death lurked at every turn, where the world's greatest survival story unfolded, proving that when a person refuses to surrender, even the most formidable conditions eventually yield. Antarctica, situated at the Earth's south pole, is one of the planet's 7 continents, renowned as its coldest and harshest environment. This region, encircled by the Antarctic Ocean, is almost entirely blanketed in snow. The cold is so extreme that temperatures in many areas plummet below -50 degrees Celsius, rendering it an almost impossible place for human habitation. Yet, this very danger ignited a spark of excitement in some individuals. One such person was the Anglo-Irish explorer, Ernest Shackleton, whose dream of conquering Antarctica burned with an unyielding passion. He first attempted to reach Antarctica in 1901 but was forced to turn back approximately 750 kilometers short of his goal due to severe weather and treacherous conditions. In 1907, he made another attempt, venturing within 2,000 kilometers of the pole, but again had to retreat just 150 kilometers from the continent itself. Despite these setbacks, this was considered the farthest south record of its time, catapulting Ernest Shackleton to fame. King Edward VII of the United Kingdom bestowed upon him the title of Knight, after which he became known as Sir Ernest Shackleton. But even this recognition could not quell his restless spirit and his persistent yearning to reach Antarctica. In 1913, Sir Ernest Shackleton conceived a new plan for an Antarctic expedition, christened the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. He declared that this time, he would not only reach Antarctica but would cross the entire continent on foot. His strategy involved his ship first reaching South Georgia Island, then navigating across the Weddell Sea. From there, he intended to land at Weddell Bay on the Antarctic coast. Following this, he and his team would traverse the entire continent, passing through the South Pole, to ultimately reach the Ross Sea. For this monumental journey, Ernest Shackleton, through fundraising, acquired a Norwegian-built ship named Endurance. The Endurance was a 3-masted sailing vessel, but to enhance its speed and capability, it was also equipped with a coal-fired steam engine, enabling it to navigate through light pack ice. Shackleton famously placed an advertisement in a newspaper that read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success." This stark description, promising no guarantee of safe return, still attracted 5,000 applications. From these, Ernest Shackleton meticulously selected only 27 individuals. His chosen crew included seasoned sailors, skilled carpenters, Navy officers, doctors, and engineers. Additionally, 6 scientists were part of the 27, tasked with conducting scientific research in Antarctica. This mission, however, was as perilous as it was ambitious. In that era, there was no GPS, satellite navigation, or modern communication. Direction and distance estimation relied solely on instruments like maps and sextants, making a small miscalculation potentially lead them astray by hundreds of kilometers. Meanwhile, World War I had erupted, but despite the global conflict, Ernest Shackleton remained steadfast in his mission. The Endurance finally departed Plymouth, England, on August 8, 1914. However, the true journey began when the ship reached South Georgia Island after approximately 3 months at sea. This was the last human settlement before the vast expanse of Antarctica. Norwegian sailors living there warned Shackleton that the sea ice this year was significantly thicker and more dangerous than usual, referring to his expedition as a human settlement, likely meaning a suicide mission. Yet, Shackleton resolved to press onward. On December 5, 1914, the ship Endurance left the stormy seas from the whaling station in South Georgia, setting sail for the world's most dangerous and mysterious continent, Antarctica. On board, besides Sir Ernest Shackleton, were 27 crew members, 69 dogs, and a cat. The ship also carried provisions, food, safety equipment, and 3 lifeboats. The dogs were essential, intended for pulling sleds across the snow. Command of the mission rested with Sir Ernest Shackleton, with Frank Wild serving as his second-in-command. Frank Worsley was the ship's captain, while the crucial responsibility of visually documenting the expedition fell to photographer and cameraman Frank Hurley. A few days later, the Endurance entered the Weddell Sea, one of the world's most treacherous marine areas. Clouds obscured the sky, and there was no sign of the sun. Despite this, the atmosphere on the ship remained cheerful, with crew members often exchanging laughter. From this point, they embarked on a journey filled with both romance and danger, destined to become an unprecedented survival story. The Weddell Sea is a marine region encircled by Antarctica on 3 sides, leading to thick layers of ice forming on its surface. Just 2 days after leaving the whaling station, the Endurance began to encounter increasing amounts of ice, which gradually reduced its speed. As days turned into weeks, the ice grew thicker. Consequently, only 9 days after departing South Georgia Island, the Endurance became increasingly mired in ice. By December 14, the ship was making little progress, but no one lost hope. Shackleton remained optimistic that the ice would soon clear. As he had anticipated, about 8 days later, on December 22, the ice began to melt. The ship then resumed its journey, moving south for the next 2 weeks. On January 10, 1916, the ship neared the coast of Antarctica, with its destination just 100 kilometers away. By January 15, the Endurance reached a point where the sea ice appeared remarkably solid. The crew believed that, if necessary, they could disembark and continue on foot across the ice. However, Shackleton felt that their true landing point, Vosel Bay, was still further south. Therefore, he directed the Endurance deeper south. In reality, they were quite close to their objective. Shackleton had miscalculated their position, a mistake that would soon transform his and his crew's lives into a living hell. This miscalculation steered the ship into an area of even denser ice. Meanwhile, by the evening of January 17, the weather took a sudden turn for the worse. Strong winds drove the ship off course, and the Endurance began to drift slowly toward the northeast, approximately 23 kilometers away from its intended position, as the layers of snow began to thicken once more. Now, the situation was dire. When the wind blew, the ship drifted in the wrong direction, and when the weather was calm, the ice held it captive. This continued for many days until, on February 14, Shackleton made the decision to shut down the ship's engine to conserve coal and ordered the crew to cut through the ice to clear a path. Everyone toiled for days, but the path could not be cleared. The ice proved impenetrable. The ice was relentlessly tightening its grip on the ship. As Antarctica's long, dark winter approached, Shackleton grew increasingly concerned that if the ship remained trapped, they would be forced to spend the entire winter in the ice. During these months, the sun would be absent, the ice would thicken, and its immense pressure could crush the ship. Knowing all this, Shackleton was powerless. The ship was stuck fast in the ice, and the open sea was a distant dream. Finally, on February 24, 1915, Shackleton decided to abandon efforts to move forward and resolved to spend the entire winter there. All the dogs were removed from the ship and housed in makeshift kennels built from ice, and the ship's interior was adapted for winter living. Shackleton held on to the hope of a miracle, recalling that 3 years prior, explorer Wilhelm Filchner's ship had also been trapped in this area but had eventually broken free. To maintain the team's morale during this period of waiting, Shackleton organized various activities for everyone, including moonlight walks, small plays and games on the ship, and dog races, ensuring that everyone's spirits remained high. Approximately 6 to 7 months passed in this manner, but despite all efforts, the situation only worsened. The ice surrounding the Endurance began to crack and exert immense pressure on its hull. Then, one day, a colossal mass of ice from the surrounding area collided with the ship, creating a deafening roar. The Endurance was critically damaged, with many large holes appearing in its stern. Faced with this catastrophe, Ernest Shackleton was forced to make the most difficult decision of his life. He ordered the ship to be evacuated immediately, as remaining on the sinking vessel for too long would prove fatal. All essential items and the 3 lifeboats were swiftly removed from the ship. Shackleton issued a clear command: each man was to take only the bare necessities for survival, everything else had to be left behind. In a short while, 28 people stood on the ice, facing an endless, silent expanse, their ship, the Endurance, slowly sinking into the depths behind them. Stranded on that desolate, snowy field in the middle of the sea, for these 28 individuals, their world had abruptly ended, with no hope of help from any direction. There was only ice all around. On October 30, 1915, Shackleton ordered his team to move forward, aiming for Paulet Island or Robertson Island. But the conditions were far more challenging than he had anticipated. After 3 days of grueling effort, they had managed to advance only 3 kilometers. Hauling lifeboats, luggage, and dogs across the snow was an arduous, almost impossible task. Shackleton, exhausted, had to make the decision to halt their progress and instructed the crew to establish a camp on a strong, floating ice floe. Together, they built a camp on a large piece of ice, which they named Ocean Camp. They were still a short distance from the sinking Endurance, allowing them to occasionally retrieve important items from it. But on November 21, 1915, the inevitable moment arrived. The Endurance finally sank completely beneath the ice into the depths of the Weddell Sea. Shackleton and his crew watched this horrifying scene, their eyes filled with sorrow. The ship that had brought them to the ends of the earth had now vanished before them. Their sole support was now the floating ice sheet on which their camp was built. Initially, the drift of this ice floe was so slow that it was imperceptible. But by the end of November, its speed increased to approximately 11 kilometers per hour. Still, it would take an immense amount of time for them to reach any landmass. So, in the 4th week of December, they decided to attempt walking towards Paulet Island. On December 23, leaving Ocean Camp, everyone began the arduous trek towards Paulet Island. But the conditions were incredibly difficult. Despite their strenuous efforts, they managed to advance only 12 kilometers while pulling heavy supplies and the 3 lifeboats across the snow. Eventually, they had to stop again and establish another camp on a strong ice floe, which they named Patience Camp. Now, the real problems began. Food rations were dwindling rapidly. Each person received only a single biscuit, some cocoa, and a small amount of high-fat meat paste per day. While they occasionally hunted seals and penguins, this was not a consistent source of food. Dehydration was severe, and their throats were so parched that swallowing food became a painful struggle. At this point, Shackleton ordered everyone to eat raw seal meat, believing its blood would make it easier to swallow. The situation deteriorated to such an extent that they were forced to kill the dogs they had brought along, and dog meat became an important part of their diet. 6 months after abandoning the ship, by the end of March 1916, their survival hung by a thread. The crew began to spot mountains in the distance, but the grim reality was that they had drifted in the opposite direction of Paulet Island. The ever-changing winds had caused the ice floe to drift erratically. Nature was testing them at every turn, preventing them from returning to their original position. Shackleton was compelled to change his objective. Initially, he hoped to reach Clarence Island, then King George Island, but finally, it was decided they would aim for Elephant Island. According to Shackleton, Elephant Island and King George Island were among the world's most remote places. Their current position was approximately 160 kilometers northwest of Elephant Island, and the ice floe had been consistently drifting in that direction for many days. Within a few days, this distance was reduced to only 50 kilometers. But during this time, another danger emerged. The ice floe on which their camp was situated was rapidly thinning and could break apart at any moment. Captain Frank Worsley, with remarkable skill, navigated for 80 hours straight. Many crew members were ill due to hunger and contaminated water, and more than half were mentally broken, their courage shattered. Yet, those who were healthy continued to row the boats. After 7 consecutive days of arduous rowing, they finally reached Elephant Island on April 16, 1916. After nearly a year and a half, they had solid ground beneath their feet. The island was desolate, cold, and barren, a place where perhaps no ship had ever called. But for them, at that moment, it was nothing short of heaven. The truth, however, was that staying alive here for long was almost impossible, as there was virtually no food on the island. The closest human settlement to Elephant Island was at least 960 kilometers away, either Cape Horn in South America or the Falkland Islands. South Georgia Island, where the main expedition base was, lay approximately 1,300 kilometers away. While Cape Horn and the Falkland Islands offered passage, the only way to reach them was through Drake Passage, one of the world's most dangerous coastal routes. Navigating this passage was akin to entering the mouth of death itself. Waves here could reach 12 meters in height, and over 20,000 sailors had lost their lives in its waters. Shackleton decided he would attempt to reach South Georgia Island. The problem was that most of the crew were too weak, taking them such a long distance by lifeboat was extremely risky. So, Shackleton decided he would travel to South Georgia Island with a small team of only 6 people, obtain help there, and then return to Elephant Island to rescue his companions. Thus, 22 people were to remain camped on Elephant Island, awaiting Shackleton's return. Shackleton entrusted the leadership of the stranded team to Frank Wild, who had been on many of his previous expeditions. After completing all preparations, on April 24, 1916, Shackleton and his 5 companions, Frank Worsley, Tom Crean, Harry McNish, John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy, boarded a small lifeboat and set off for South Georgia Island, crossing the Scotia Sea. The plan was to sail for 4 hours and rest for 4 hours. But the sea's waves were so ferocious that water frequently swamped the boat. For the next 16 days, they battled relentlessly against the vast, dangerous waves and fierce winds. They constantly bailed water from the boat and chipped away at the ice that froze inside. Finally, one day, they spotted South Georgia Island in the distance. They were now only 5 kilometers away. The crew was utterly exhausted, their strength to paddle completely gone. They dropped their paddles, feeling as if all hope was lost. Yet, after 17 harrowing days on this perilous journey, Sir Shackleton and his 5 companions finally reached the west coast of South Georgia. Upon reaching the shore, their joy knew no bounds, and they embraced each other in exhilaration. They believed their greatest struggle was over, but when they realized their exact location, their happiness vanished in an instant. They had landed on the uninhabited side of the island. Human settlements, with whaling stations, were on the opposite side. To reach them, they would have to cross approximately 40 kilometers of snow-covered mountains and glaciers. In their current state, they could barely take another step. So, they decided to rest. They hunted seals and other sea creatures nearby to regain some strength, preparing for what would be the most difficult trek of their story. The mountains of South Georgia Island were so treacherous that no one had ever crossed them on foot before. But Shackleton and his companions now had no other option. Even after 9 days of rest, Harry McNish, John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy had not recovered enough to continue. So, on May 19, 1916, Ernest Shackleton left them there and began to ascend the thousands of meters high mountains with Frank Worsley and Tom Crean. Their greatest challenge was not knowing the correct path. They simply climbed whatever mountain lay before them. Deep crevasses and sheer rock faces often blocked their way. When they could go no further, they would descend and attempt to climb another mountain. After hours of trying, they still struggled to find the right direction. After approximately 24 hours of continuous climbing, they finally reached a mountain summit. From a distance, they heard the distinct sound of a whistle carried by the wind from the Stromness whaling station. This was the first time in nearly 2 years that they had heard the sound of human activity, confirming they were heading in the right direction. After walking for a few more hours, the 3 men reached the whaling station by noon. They were utterly spent, having descended from the mountains for 36 consecutive hours. This was the very island from which, 532 days prior, they had departed for Antarctica, and now fate had brought them back. But upon reaching the whaling station, not a single person recognized them. All 3 had thick, unruly beards, their faces were blackened, and their clothes were severely torn. Seeing them, the whaling station manager asked in astonishment, "Who the hell are you?" Ernest Shackleton replied slowly, "My name is Shackleton." Everyone was stunned to hear this, as the world had long believed that Ernest Shackleton and his entire team were dead. Yet, here stood 3 of them, alive. The whaling station manager immediately provided them with food, new clothes, and a bed to sleep in, allowing them to finally rest after such an arduous ordeal. Although Ernest Shackleton had reached South Georgia Island with his 2 companions, his heart ached for the 22 crew members stranded on Elephant Island. He immediately began trying to rescue his crew. On May 23, 1916, he made his first rescue attempt, setting off for Elephant Island on a whaling boat. But the dense sea ice blocked their path, forcing them to return. After that, he reached the Falkland Islands and began preparing for a second attempt. On June 10, 1916, the second rescue attempt was made, but again, walls of ice prevented the ship from moving forward. A third attempt on July 12, 1916, also failed due to impassable sea ice. Shackleton, undeterred by repeated failures, refused to give up. He sought another opportunity, this time appealing to the Chilean government for help, which provided him with a steam tug named Yelcho. On August 25, 1916, Shackleton departed for Elephant Island for the 4th time. There, Frank Wild had diligently built a shelter for his companions on Elephant Island, a small hut fashioned from 2 inverted lifeboats and stones. Whenever the crew's morale began to falter, Frank Wild would always say, "Pack your bags, lads, the boss might come today." But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and their boss did not return. They had spent 4 agonizing months on Elephant Island and had begun to believe that the lifeboat might have sunk on the way, and their boss would never return. In desperation, they decided to take a lifeboat and head for another island. But just before leaving Elephant Island, on August 30, 1916, they suddenly spotted a ship in the distance, heading directly towards them. At first, no one believed it, but after a while, it became clear that the ship belonged to their boss, Ernest Shackleton. Within a few hours, Shackleton stood among his companions. He was astonished to find that all 22 of his companions were still alive and relatively well on that desolate and deserted island, even after 128 days. Tears of joy filled everyone's eyes. Some were hugging each other, others were sharing their incredible experiences. Ernest Shackleton brought everyone aboard that same day, and on September 3, 1916, they all safely reached Punta Arenas, Chile. After nearly 2 years of battling ice, storms, and high seas, the expedition finally concluded. Shackleton had set out with 28 people, and against all odds, he returned with all 28. Nearly 106 years later, in 2022, the ship Endurance was discovered approximately 3,000 meters below the surface, its wreck still remarkably preserved in the sea today. On January 5, 1922, Sir Ernest Shackleton passed away at the age of 47. He had set out to cross Antarctica on foot but could not complete his original mission. Nevertheless, in history, his name is etched as a leader who, under impossible circumstances, brought back every single one of his companions alive. This is why Shackleton's survival story resonates so powerfully even today, a testament to indomitable human spirit.